The sterile, pressurized air of the Sector 9 detention complex tasted of ozone and cold iron, a sharp contrast to the humid afternoon they had left behind in the Virginia suburbs. Elias Thorne gripped the small, soft hands of his daughters, Clara and Sophie, feeling the slight tremor in their fingers as they passed through the third shimmering energy veil. This visit was meant to be a controlled exposure, a sanctioned pedagogical tour for high-ranking families to witness the order of peace that humanity had established after the Great Expansion. Elias, a veteran archivist of the Interstellar Ministry, knew the official narrative by heart, that the beings behind the glass were remnants of chaotic civilizations that refused the Terran Accord. He walked with his back straight, his eyes scanning the corridor, playing the role of the protective father and loyal citizen, unaware that the very foundation of his reality was about to fracture under the innocent gaze of his children. The great hall loomed ahead, a cathedral of brutalist architecture and pulsating blue containment fields where the most significant captives were displayed like living artifacts. Each cell held a story of a broken world, beings of bioluminescent skin or crystalline carapaces now dulled by the suppression fields that dampened their natural abilities. Elias spoke in a low, measured voice, explaining the importance of the chains, describing them as necessary tethers to ensure the safety of the earth they called home. His daughters listened in a silence that felt heavier than usual, their wide eyes reflecting the flickering lights of the prison, moving not with fear, but with a strange, haunting curiosity. They didn't look at the hulking beasts or the snarling predators that the guards pointed out with pride. They seemed to be searching for something specific, something hidden in the static of the detention center. Suddenly, in the heart of the high-security wing, the girls stopped simultaneously. Their movements so synchronized, it sent a chill down Elias's spine. They were standing before a cell that seemed almost empty at first glance, shrouded in a denser, violet-hued dampening field that hummed with a violent frequency. Inside stood a figure of haunting grace, an ethereal being, with skin the color of a dying star, etched with intricate glowing markings that pulsed slowly like a fading heartbeat. She was bound by suppressor chains that looked like liquid obsidian, wrapping around her throat, wrists, and ankles, anchoring her to the cold floor. Unlike the other prisoners, she didn't pace or glare. She stood perfectly still, her long, silver-tinged hair cascading over shoulders that refused to bow despite the literal weight of the world upon them. Clara and Sophie lifted their arms at the exact same moment, their index fingers steady and unwavering as they pointed directly at the silent captive. Their voices rose in a chilling, melodic unison that echoed off the metallic walls, cutting through the ambient noise of the facility. "That one, Father. That one." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight of recognition that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Elias's bones. He looked at the alien, then at his daughters, and then back at the alien's skin, specifically the markings near her collarbone that were now glowing a fierce rhythmic gold. The air in the corridor suddenly felt too thin to breathe as Elias's professional mask shattered, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The symbols were not the random markings of a fringe species, as the Ministry's database had always claimed. They were the royal sigils of the Ethelguard, the Starbringers. As an archivist, Elias had seen these symbols once before, in a classified, half-burned ledger from the pre-expansion era, a document that shouldn't have existed. These were the markings of the architects of the very sun that warmed Earth, a race that humanity hadn't defeated, but had supposedly made a pact with. Seeing them here, on a woman treated like a common criminal, meant that every history book Elias had ever curated was a lie built on a foundation of betrayal. The realization hit him like a physical blow, making his knees weak as the beautiful alien slowly lifted her head, her eyes meeting his with a depth of sorrow and power that defied her chains. Elias felt the world tilting on its axis as the peace he had spent his life documenting revealed itself to be a high-stakes kidnapping of a cosmic deity. If this woman was, who the markings claimed she was, the last princess of the Ethelgard, then her presence in this cell wasn't a matter of security, but a cosmic crime. Her chains weren't just suppressing her power, they were holding back the literal wrath of a civilization that humanity had deceived into thinking she was dead. The silence in the hall became deafening, broken only by the frantic thumping of Elias's heart against his ribs. He wanted to turn his daughters away, to run back to the safety of their suburban home and forget the glow in their eyes, but he found himself rooted to the spot. His daughters didn't flinch as a red light began to pulse from the ceiling, sensing the sudden spike in the prisoner's biosignature. "She's crying, Daddy," Sophie whispered, though the alien's face remained a mask of regal stoicism. "She says it's time to go home, and we have the keys." Elias looked down at his daughter's hands and noticed for the first time a faint, matching shimmer on their own palms, a resonance he couldn't explain. How could his children, born and raised on Earth, have a biological connection to a being from the deep void? The questions were screaming in his mind, threatening to tear his sanity apart, as he realized his family was somehow the catalyst for a revelation he wasn't prepared to handle. The guards began to converge, their heavy boots clanking on the gridded floor, their hands hovering over their pulse rifles. They had noticed the daughter's strange behavior and the archivist's visible distress, and in Sector 9, any deviation from the script was treated as a breach. "Sir, please move the children away from the glass immediately," the lead guard barked, his voice distorted by his helmet speakers. Elias didn't move. He couldn't move. He was staring at the alien's shackles, seeing the way the obsidian links were beginning to hairline fracture, reacting to the mere presence of his daughters. The beautiful alien offered a small, tragic smile, a gesture of recognition that confirmed Elias's worst fears. His daughters weren't just pointing at a prisoner, they were identifying an ancestor. The air began to hum, with a low-frequency vibration that rattled the glass of the nearby cells, causing other prisoners to retreat into the shadows in fear. Elias remembered the legend now, the children of the two sons, a prophecy hidden in the suppressed archives about a lineage that would bridge the gap between the captors and the creators. He looked at Clara and Sophie, seeing not just his little girls, but the inheritors of a cosmic debt that was now due for collection. The father froze because he knew that the moment he acknowledged what his daughters had found, he was declaring war on his own species. He was no longer just a father, he was the guardian of the truth that could either save humanity or burn the sky to ash. The lead guard reached out to grab Elias's shoulder, his patience evaporated. But as his hand touched the archivist's coat, a spark of golden static discharged, throwing the armored man back several feet. The alarm system finally transitioned from a rhythmic pulse to a continuous piercing scream that signaled a Tier 1 containment breach. The energy fields around the alien's cell flickered, the violet light turning a brilliant, blinding white as the suppressor chains groaned under an invisible force. The girls didn't cover their ears. They stood like statues of light, their eyes locked onto the princess, who was now beginning to levitate inches off the ground. In that frozen moment, Elias saw the faces of his daughters reflected in the containment glass, and for a split second, their features shifted, blending with the celestial anatomy of the woman behind the barrier. They were the key, just as she had said, and their intuition had bypassed decades of ministry brainwashing in a single heartbeat. The father's mind raced through the protocols. He should call for backup. He should secure the children. He should report the anomaly. But as he looked at the criminal and saw the divine grace of a stolen queen, the loyal citizen in him died, and the protector was born. He knew what that one meant. It wasn't a choice of curiosity, it was an edict of destiny. The chapter ends as the first security blast doors begin to hiss shut, sealing them inside the great hall with the guards, the dying light of the suppressor fields, and the awakening goddess. Elias pulled his daughters close, not to hide them, but to brace them for the shockwave he knew was coming. The alien's eyes flared with the brightness of a supernova, and the obsidian chains shattered like glass. The father didn't run. He stood his ground, watching as the beautiful alien stepped through the failing energy field, her hand reaching out toward his daughters. The choice was no longer whether to stay or go, but whether to fall with the old world or rise with the new one his children had just summoned. The immediate aftermath of the containment breach was a chaotic blur of strobe lights and the frantic shouting of tactical teams. Elias found himself shoved into a cold interrogation room within the same complex, separated from his daughters by a thick pane of reinforced polymer that muffled their voices, but not their unsettlingly calm expressions. Across from him sat Director Holloway, a woman whose face was a map of cold ambition and decades of state secrets, her eyes boring into Elias as if trying to dissect his very thoughts. The air between them was thick with the smell of scorched electronics and the unspoken weight of the treason Elias had committed by simply being there when the anomaly responded to his bloodline. Holloway didn't ask about his well-being. She demanded to know how two children could bypass the most advanced dampening technology in the solar system with a single gesture. Outside the room, the detention center had transformed into a war zone of bureaucracy and fear, with scientists scrambling to analyze the resonance patterns left in the wake of the princess's brief awakening. Elias felt a profound sense of isolation, a sudden realization that the walls he had helped build to keep the others out were now closing in on him and his family. He tried to argue for his daughter's innocence, claiming it was a freak coincidence, a psychological reaction to the stress of the environment, but the director simply played back the footage. On the screen, Clara and Sophie looked less like children and more like conductors of a silent symphony, their "that one" echoing with a chilling authority that no human child should possess. Holloway leaned in, her voice a sharp whisper. They didn't just point, Elias. They commanded. And she obeyed. The internal conflict within Elias began to tear him apart as he realized the ministry was no longer looking at him as an archivist, but as a biological threat. He thought of his late wife, a woman whose lineage was a mystery even to him, a scientist who had died in a laboratory accident that he was now beginning to suspect was something far more sinister. Had she known? Had she passed something down to their girls that was now blooming like a dormant virus in the presence of its source? The guilt of his ignorance sat like lead in his stomach, clashing with the primal urge to protect his offspring from the very people he had served his entire adult life. He was a man of records and history, yet he found himself standing at the center of a story that was being erased in real time by the sirens outside. As the hours dragged on, the pressure from the ministry intensified, moving from questions to thinly veiled threats against his daughter's future. They wanted to study the girls, to put them through the same harrowing neurological tests that had broken so many of the captives in the lower levels. Elias felt a flare of protective rage, a heat in his chest that seemed to mirror the golden glow he had seen on the princess's skin. He realized that the Order of Peace was nothing more than a cage, and he had been one of its most diligent zookeepers. Every moral compromise he had made for his career, every classified document he had filed away without question, now stood as a barrier between him and the survival of his family. Meanwhile, the beautiful alien, designated as Subject 0A, remained in a state of suspended animation in a new reinforced vacuum chamber, her presence looming over the facility like a ticking time bomb. Reports leaked through the intercoms of guards suffering from empathy seizures, overwhelmed by the sorrow and memory of the captive as she lay in her forced coma. The facility was vibrating, not physically, but on a psychic level that made everyone on edge, causing tensions between the different branches of the ministry to boil over. Some wanted to execute her immediately to stop the resonance. Others wanted to use the girls as a bridge to harness her power, turning the sacred connection into a weapon of war. Elias was eventually allowed a brief moment with his daughters under heavy surveillance, a desperate attempt by Holloway to see if the girls would reveal more in their father's presence. Sophie gripped his hand, her small fingers surprisingly hot to the touch, and whispered, "The Queen is lonely, Daddy. She's waiting for the third key." Elias froze, his mind racing through the ancient texts he had archived, the 3 keys of the solar gate. 2 were of the blood, and 1 was of the spirit. He looked into his daughter's eyes and saw a wisdom that transcended their years, a terrifying clarity that made him realize they weren't being manipulated. They were the ones in control. The moral dilemma reached its zenith when Holloway offered Elias a deal: cooperate with the extraction of the girls' neural patterns, and they would be allowed to live in a protected facility for the rest of their lives. If he refused, they would be declared invasive biological contaminants and processed accordingly. The weight of the choice was crushing: to betray his daughter's unique nature to save their physical bodies, or to risk everything on a gamble of cosmic proportions. He looked at the guards at the door, men he had shared coffee with, now looking at him with suspicion and cold detachment, and he realized there was no middle ground left in the ministry's world. The tension in the facility reached a breaking point when a low-level tremor shook the foundation, followed by a sudden total blackout of the primary power grid. In the darkness, the only thing Elias could see were the glowing markings on his daughter's skin, shining through their clothes like beacons in a storm. The screams of the dampening fields failing echoed through the vents, and for a moment the heavy silence of the vacuum chamber seemed to transmit a single, powerful thought into Elias's mind. Choose. It wasn't the director asking, but the princess herself, reaching out through the void. He felt the ancient conflict of his ancestors, the betrayal of the Starbringers, vibrating in his blood, demanding a resolution. He thought of the peace humanity enjoyed, a peace bought with the literal chains of a goddess, and he asked himself if such a world deserved to continue. Every comfortable day he had spent was a theft from the beings who had gifted humanity the stars. The conflict wasn't just about his daughters anymore. It was about the soul of the human race. Would they remain a species of jailers, or would they find the courage to be partners in the cosmos? The pressure from the ministry was external, but the pressure from his own conscience was a volcanic force, threatening to erupt and reshape the landscape of his life. In the flickering emergency lights, Elias saw the director approaching with a sedative-filled syringe, her face twisted in a mask of necessary evil. He looked at Clara and Sophie, who stood tall and unafraid, their hands outstretched toward him as if waiting for a signal. The father made his choice not out of logic, but out of the same intuition that had led his daughters to that cell. He didn't see an alien. He saw a mother, a queen, and a mirror of his own children's potential. The paths had collided, and the path of the loyal archivist was now a dead end. As Holloway reached for Sophie, Elias moved with a speed he didn't know he possessed, intercepting the director's arm and twisting it with a ferocity that shocked them both. The alarm klaxons blared again, but this time they sounded like a funeral dirge for the old order. "They aren't your subjects," Elias hissed, his voice echoing with a strange, harmonic resonance that caused the lights to flare. "And she is not your prisoner." The transition from a man of peace to a man of revolution was complete, and the cost was his status, his safety, and his world. The chapter ends with Elias, Clara, and Sophie backed against the reinforced door of the interrogation room as the tactical teams began to cut through the metal. They were trapped in the heart of the enemy's fortress, with no weapons and no plan except for the third key that Sophie had mentioned. Elias looked at his daughters and realized that the third key wasn't an object or a person. It was an act of faith. He closed his eyes and, for the first time in his life, he didn't try to document history. He prepared to change it, listening for the silent voice of the Queen to guide them through the fire. The steel door to the interrogation room didn't just open, it disintegrated into a cloud of glowing particles as the vacuum chamber in the center of the facility imploded. A shockwave of pure, unadulterated grief swept through Sector 9, knocking every human to their knees as the princess's consciousness finally bridged the gap between dimensions. Elias felt his mind flooded with images of a son being birthed from the void, of a civilization that built cathedrals out of light, and the agonizing sting of a betrayal that had lasted 10,000 years. This was the break, the moment when the carefully constructed facade of human supremacy shattered against the reality of a cosmic injustice. The princess didn't just step out of her cell, she stepped out of the very concept of imprisonment, her body radiating a heat that turned the surrounding air into a shimmering mirage. Director Holloway scrambled backward, her eyes wide with a terror that her protocols couldn't account for, as the beautiful alien floated through the wreckage of the high-security wing. The suppressor chains lay on the floor, like dead snakes, their obsidian links drained of all color and power. The guards fired their pulse rifles, but the projectiles didn't hit their mark. They simply slowed down and dissolved into harmless sparks of light before reaching the princess's aura. Elias watched, breathless, as the being his daughters had pointed at approached them. Her feet never touching the ground, her golden markings now so bright they illuminated the entire corridor like a miniature sun. The girls didn't flinch. They stepped forward, their small faces tilted upward in a look of profound recognition and relief. The third key was revealed in that moment of contact. It was the act of a human, Elias, voluntarily breaking the chains of fear that had bound his species. As the princess reached out, her fingers brushing the foreheads of Clara and Sophie, a pillar of light erupted from the facility, piercing through the miles of reinforced concrete and soaring into the Virginia night sky. The very geography of the area began to warp, the trees outside the detention center bowing toward the light, and the animals in the surrounding forests falling silent. This wasn't just a prison break. It was a planetary awakening, a signal sent to the far reaches of the galaxy that the stolen queen had been found. Inside the facility, the break was more than physical. It was psychological. The hundreds of other prisoners, sensing the shift in the cosmic balance, began to hum a low, resonant chord that shook the very foundation of the earth. The guards dropped their weapons, some weeping from the sudden influx of the captives' memories, while others stood paralyzed by the sheer majesty of the being before them. Elias felt the archivist within him screaming as he realized that the history he had protected was being rewritten in seconds, the ink of the past dissolving to make room for a future he couldn't predict. He saw the director's face, a mask of cold order now crumbling into the realization that humanity was not the master of its own destiny. The princess spoke then, not with words, but with a vibration that settled into the core of everyone's mind, a voice that sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates and the singing of stars. "The debt is acknowledged," she echoed, her eyes fixed on Elias. She didn't seek revenge, she sought restoration, but the restoration required the removal of the cancer that had grown in the dark, the ministry and its lies. She raised her hands, and the facility began to peel away like layers of an onion, the heavy metal walls folding back to reveal the night sky. The sanctioned diplomatic visit had become an interstellar judgment, and Elias was the only witness who understood the full scale of the crime being rectified. Suddenly, a hidden defense system, the Sol Ignis Array, activated from the moon's surface, a weapon designed by the ministry as a fail-safe for this exact scenario. A beam of concentrated solar energy tore through the atmosphere, aimed directly at the Sector 9 complex, intended to incinerate everything and everyone to keep the secret buried. The break reached its tragic peak as the beam hit the princess's shield, the collision of energies creating a localized supernova that threatened to vaporize the surrounding miles of civilian suburbs. Elias threw himself over his daughters, ready to be burned to ash, but the heat never came. Instead, he felt a cooling celestial wind. The princess had redirected the beam, but the effort was causing her physical form to flicker and crack, the toll of 10 millennia of suppression finally catching up to her. She looked at Clara and Sophie, and for a fleeting second, Elias saw a mother looking at her children across a vast, impossible distance. The realization hit him. His daughters weren't just keys because of their blood. They were the reincarnated essence of the Starbringer's own line, hidden on Earth to await this day. The beautiful alien wasn't just a queen, she was their biological origin, and the break was a family reunion that the universe had tried to prevent with every law of physics. As the moonbeam intensified, the princess let out a cry of such pure, crystalline sorrow that the glass in every building for 10 miles shattered simultaneously. She didn't fight the beam anymore. She absorbed it, turning the weapon of human fear into a fuel for her final transformation. The facility was gone, replaced by a crater of glass and light, where the 4 of them stood in the center of a swirling vortex of energy. Elias felt his own body being pulled into the stream, his memories of Earth, his career, and his human life being stripped away to reveal a core of starlight he never knew he possessed. The break concluded with a final blinding flare that could be seen from the orbit of Mars. When the light subsided, the princess was gone, and in her place stood a shimmering doorway made of the very obsidian that had once been her chains. The Ministry's forces were silent. Their weapons melted, their leaders huddled in bunkers, staring at screens that showed only static. The barrier between the worlds had been irrevocably torn, and the truth humanity buried was now the only thing left standing in the ruins of the detention hall. Elias stood up, his clothes singed but his body unharmed, and looked at his daughters. They were different now, taller somehow, with a grace that didn't belong to the suburbs of Virginia. Their eyes were the color of the nebula that now glowed in the night sky, where the moon once sat in darkness. They looked at the doorway, then at their father, their expressions filled with a mix of ancient wisdom and childlike love. The break was complete. The old world was dead, and the father was left standing on the threshold of a reality that no archive could ever contain. The chapter ends with the sound of thousands of alien ships dropping out of warp speed in the upper atmosphere, their hulls glowing with the same markings that were on the princess's skin. The beautiful alien had been found, and the catastrophe the father had feared was not an invasion, but a homecoming. The father froze not out of fear this time, but out of the sheer, overwhelming beauty of the truth his children had sensed. The chains were gone, but the weight of what came next was just beginning to settle on his shoulders. The silence that followed the Great Awakening was more terrifying than the noise of the battle. Across the United States, and then the world, every screen, every radio, and every digital device displayed a single image, the shimmering obsidian gateway standing in the ruins of Sector 9. The consequences of Elias's choice and his daughter's intuition rippled through the global psyche like a seismic wave. Humanity, for the first time in its history, was forced to look into the mirror and see a jailer staring back. The ministry had collapsed within hours, its leaders fleeing into deep space outposts or being dragged from their bunkers by a populace that realized they had been living a lie fueled by the stolen power of a goddess. Elias sat on the edge of the crater, his daughters leaning against him, watching as the first of the Ethelgard ships descended with a silent, terrifying grace. These weren't war machines, they were floating gardens of light, humming with a frequency that seemed to heal the scarred earth wherever they passed. The consequence for Elias was a total loss of his identity. He was no longer an archivist, a citizen, or even human in the way he had understood it. He felt a strange, phantom humming in his own limbs, a resonance with the ships above that confirmed the terrifying truth. He, too, was a product of the ancient mingling of races, a carrier of the spark that the Ministry had tried to extinguish. The social order of Earth began to fray as the reality of the Starbringer's return set in. In the cities there were riots of both fear and worship, with some calling for the destruction of the alien invaders and others kneeling in the streets, begging for the celestial healing they felt in the air. The beautiful alien had not returned from the gateway yet, but her influence was everywhere, stripping away the technological crutches humanity had relied on. The suppressor-based energy grids failed, plunging the world into a pre-industrial darkness that was lit only by the glowing hulls of the Ethelgard fleet. Elias watched as the lights of Virginia went out, replaced by the ancient, cold light of the stars that seemed closer than ever before. Clara and Sophie were the most affected by the consequences. They had become the focal points for the entire planet's curiosity and dread. They didn't speak of dolls or school or the life they had left behind. They spoke of the weaving and the great return. Their voices had taken on a melodic, echoing quality that made Elias's heart ache with a sense of loss. He had saved his daughters from the Ministry's needles, but he was losing them to their own divinity. The consequence of his choice was the realization that he was merely the guardian of a transition, a bridge that was being walked across and then burned behind them. In the higher echelons of what remained of the government, a desperate faction attempted to launch a final strike against the Obsidian Gateway, believing that if they could close the door, they could reclaim their world. Elias watched from the crater as a fleet of human fighter jets screamed across the sky, their engines struggling in the altered atmosphere. He didn't feel anger toward them. He felt a profound pity. They were trying to fight the ocean with spoons, unable to grasp that the world they were trying to save was a cage they had outgrown. The jets didn't crash. They simply stopped in mid-air. Their pilots gently floated to the ground by an invisible force. Their machines turned into sculptures of inert metal. The environmental consequences were equally staggering. Plants that had been extinct for millennia began to sprout from the scorched earth of the crater, glowing with bioluminescent patterns that matched the princess's markings. The air became rich with oxygen and strange, aromatic compounds that sharpened the senses and cleared the mind. People reported that chronic illnesses were vanishing, and the empathy seizures that had plagued the guards were now spreading to the general population, creating a collective consciousness of the Starbringer's history. The world was literally being terraformed back into a paradise, but it was a paradise that humanity didn't yet know how to inhabit. Elias was approached by a group of survivors, former colleagues and soldiers who had deserted the Ministry, who looked to him for guidance. He was the father of the Keys, the man who had stood by the princess as the world broke. He realized the consequence of his action was leadership he never wanted. He had to explain to them that the Ethelgard weren't there to rule, but to reconcile. He found himself using the very skills he had as an archivist, but instead of hiding history, he was translating it for a terrified species. He told them of the pact, of the theft of the princess, and of the debt that was now being paid in the form of a second chance. Inside the gateway, a soft, rhythmic pulsing began to emanate, drawing the girls closer every hour. Elias felt a growing fear that once they entered, he would never see them again. The personal consequence of his heroism was the ultimate sacrifice, letting go of the things he loved most to ensure their purpose was fulfilled. He remembered the moment in the hall when they pointed and said, "That one," and he realized they hadn't been identifying a prisoner. They were identifying their destination. He was just the one who had to carry them to the door. The global economy had vanished, replaced by a strange gift-based survivalism where the Ethelgard ships provided for the basic needs of those who approached them with peace. The consequence of the alien presence was the total obsolescence of human greed. Without the need for suppressed energy profits, the structures of power simply dissolved. Elias saw a high-ranking general trading his medals for a piece of the starbread that the Ethelgard drones distributed, a sight so surreal it would have been laughable if it weren't so deeply moving. The world was being stripped to its barest, most honest form. As the sun rose on the third day after the break, the princess finally stepped out of the obsidian gateway. She was no longer chained or beautiful in a human sense. She was a towering figure of pure, crystalline light, her form shifting between 1,000 different shapes. Behind her stood a council of beings that defied human biological classification. The consequence of her return was the formal end of human independence. Earth was being reintegrated into a galactic community it had forgotten it belonged to. The princess looked at Elias, and for a moment the world held its breath. She didn't speak to the crowds or the cameras that were still miraculously functioning. She walked to Elias and placed a hand on his chest, right over his heart. He felt a surge of cold, brilliant energy that rewritten his DNA in a final, agonizing and ecstatic burst. The consequence for Elias was the end of his mortality. He was being prepared for the journey ahead, a transformation that would allow him to walk beside his daughters in the realms they were destined to rule. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a witness, the first of a new kind of human. The chapter ends with Elias, Clara, and Sophie standing at the edge of the gateway, looking back at the ruins of Virginia. A new city of light was already beginning to grow out of the ground, its spires reaching for the Ethelgard ships. The father took his daughter's hands, mirroring the way he had held them as they entered the detention center. The consequences were total, devastating, and beautiful. They stepped into the light, leaving behind a world that was finally, after 10,000 years, truly free. The Obsidian Gateway did not lead to another planet, but to a state of being where time and memory flowed like a single golden river. In this resolution, Elias Thorne found himself standing in a garden that spanned the width of a galaxy, where every star was a blossom and every planet a seed. Clara and Sophie were no longer just his daughters. They were the dual regents of the new era, their forms now stabilized into beings of iridescent grace that moved with the confidence of creators. The princess, now fully restored to her title as the Solar Weaver, stood at the center of this cosmic garden, her presence no longer a source of tension, but the very heartbeat of the new reality. The resolution for Earth was not one of destruction, but of profound metamorphosis. Through the gateway, Elias could see the progress of his home world. The cities of steel and glass were being integrated with the living architecture of the Ethelgard. The old detention centers were being turned into halls of remembrance, where humans and aliens sat together to study the history of the Great Betrayal, so it would never be repeated. The beautiful alien had turned her chains into a bridge, and the resolution of the conflict was a peace that wasn't enforced by energy fields, but by the shared understanding of a common soul. Humanity had been forgiven, not because they deserved it, but because the Starbringers knew that a species raised in fear could only learn through the example of absolute grace. Elias's personal resolution came when the princess approached him one final time in the Celestial Garden. She showed him a vision of his late wife, not a human scientist who died in an accident, but an Ethelgard scout who had chosen to become mortal to plant the seeds of the Three Keys. The accident had been her return to the stars, a necessary step to ensure the bloodline was in place for the day of the pointing. Elias felt the last of his human grief dissolve, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. He hadn't been a victim of fate. He had been the chosen partner of a goddess, the anchor that held the light to the earth until it was strong enough to burn on its own. The two daughters, sensing their father's peace, came to him and hugged him, their touch no longer burning but warm and familiar. "You did it, Daddy," Sophie whispered, her voice a chorus of 1,000 suns. "You saw us. You didn't look away." The resolution of the story was found in that single parental act, the courage to trust the intuition of the innocent over the logic of the fearful. Elias realized that the catastrophe he had feared was only the death of his own limitations. By freezing in that hallway and then choosing to move forward with his children, he had saved more than just their lives. He had saved the future of every soul on earth. The ministry's remnants were not executed. They were given a choice to remain in the old world or to step through the gateway and be rewoven. Director Holloway was the first to step through, her face finally losing its mask of cold ambition as she dissolved into the light, her consciousness being scrubbed of its shadows to begin a new cycle of existence. The resolution of justice was not retribution, but transformation. Every chain that had been forged in Sector 9 was melted down to create the foundations of the new Alexandria, a library that would hold the combined knowledge of all sentient races. As the resolution reached its peak, the obsidian gateway began to fade, becoming a permanent part of the Earth's sky, a second moon that glowed with a soft, protective light. The Ethelgard fleet departed, leaving behind a planet that was no longer a prison, but a nursery. Elias stood with his daughters on the threshold of the stars, looking down at the blue marble of Earth, which now pulsed with a faint, golden rhythm. The ancient conflict was over, the royalty had returned, and the truth was no longer buried in archives. It was written in the very air the people breathed. The father didn't return to his house in Virginia. That life was a suit of clothes he had outgrown. Instead, he became the first ambassador to the deep void, a human who had seen the heart of a goddess and lived to tell the story. His resolution was to be the storyteller for the ages, the one who would remind the universe that even in the darkest detention halls, innocence could find the light. He looked at Clara and Sophie, who were already busy weaving the next dawn for a distant star system, and he felt a smile spread across his face, a smile of a man who had finally found his place in the grand design. In the final moments of the narrative, the scene shifts back to a small human child on Earth, years later, looking up at the obsidian moon. The child points a finger at the beautiful shimmering light and says to her father, "That one." The father doesn't freeze this time. He smiles, takes her hand, and says, "Yes, that one." That's where the story began. The cycle of intuition and recognition was now the new heritage of humanity, a resolution that ensured fear would never again be the primary language of the stars. The story closes on a cinematic shot of the galaxy, the golden markings of the Ethelgard now appearing as a web of light connecting every planet. The beautiful chained alien was now the free queen of the all, and her first act of freedom was to ensure that no being would ever be chained by their identity again. The father, the daughters, and the queen, a trinity of truth that had rewritten the laws of the universe through a single, impossible choice. The resolution is complete. The conflict is healed, the characters have ascended, and the world is reborn. The camera pulls back until the entire Milky Way is just a single spark in the eye of a child, a reminder that every grand cosmic drama starts with the simple, pure intuition of the heart. The chains are gone, the gateway is open, and the journey has only just begun.